Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how I painted the Jack Russell here on the left. Now what I'm going to do, if you'd like me to create another video like this showing how I did the second dog, then I'm more than happy to do so. Let me know in the comments below. But for this I just wanted to focus on the one here on the left because he's got a little bit more of that darker colouring. So if you've seen many of my videos here on YouTube, you'll know that I like to start off with the eye first. That's just my personal preference. Once I've got that background in place, I will always then sketch out my subject and then I will focus on the eye. I like to get that fairly complete, 90-95% complete. There are a few things I might tweak on it, but I do want to get that done and in place so that I know I've captured the expression that I want in the eye, given how important the eye itself is. Now the one thing you'll notice here is at times I will use my hairdryer to dry some of these layers. Now one of the common criticisms that acrylics get is that they dry too fast, but most of the time here I was actually speeding up the drying time so that I could get my second layer on top as quickly as I could. And once the second layer there was drying, I could then map in my areas here of the first layer of fur. Now I like to break my tutorials and the subjects that I'm working on into small individual sections. I do think this breaks down a painting in a much manageable way. If you find that you are looking at your reference photo too often and you don't really know where you should start and you hesitate a little bit, one of the most biggest things that can help with that is to break down that painting into small sections. Now this is how I've always worked, and I do find that it is certainly it keeps you motivated because that one area you're working on resembles more like that reference photo than if you worked in individual set layers. I find that you can end up being at that ugly stage for far too long. Now here where I start adding details, this is already starting to look like this dog and the reference photo, which for me personally is the one main thing that keeps me, as I say, motivated to keep on painting. So what I like to do is get an area about 80% complete and then I'll move on to the next. Now the biggest thing here that I am working on is the layering. I want to make sure that I've built up a lot of depth here. Now the one thing that the biggest thing to consider is you don't want to be jumping to your brightest highlights first. You'll see here that I put a darker base layer down and then I'm building up my layers gradually. I'm not really focusing on the colour here. You can see that these details looked a little bit washed out. They're a little bit too pale. They don't have enough brown colour there. But I'm really not focusing on that because I'm going to glaze additional colours on top. This is what I'm doing here. And the glazes work perfectly. As long as you make sure the layer underneath is completely dry, you can adjust that colour accordingly. You could do a black and white painting and only add the colours at a later stage just with glazes. Now the paints that I like to use are Liquitex Basics, so they are naturally quite transparent anyway, so they work really well for this. Sometimes people like using glazer mediums, but I find I don't have to use them. I do just thin my paints with water when I am trying to do a glaze. Now while that fur was drying, I can then work on the ear. Now the one thing you'll notice is when I have got my hairdryer here, the blacks in particular look like they fade. They go sort of like a darker shade of grey almost. And that's one of the common complaints that acrylics get, is that they fade. Well, it's not that they're fading. Obviously, as long as you're using the light fast colours here like what I am, they're not fading. They won't fade even if you aren't using light fast colours. They don't fade as quickly as what you could see there with that hairdryer. What's actually happening is as the paint's drying, Liquitex Basics naturally dries as a matte finish. Now I personally like that about Liquitex Basics because it does make them easier to photograph, but you can then have that issue where they do look a little bit flat. Not that they're faded, it's just that they can dry flat. Now the only instance where I find that can be a little bit of a problem is when I want to judge my contrast. Now the reason being, when you varnish this painting, all of these colours are going to look like that paint was what it was like when it was wet. So that's how I like to have my paintings finished. So I do personally use a gloss varnish to achieve that. So one thing you can do throughout the painting process is get a clean, large brush and just with a little bit of water on, run that across your painting. Now you do want to make sure that your painting is completely dry before you try this, but what that will do is put a thin layer of water over your canvas and you will then be able to see what that painting looked like once it's varnished. You'll be able to then see whether or not you need to make the dark portions of your painting any darker, and the same with your highlights, whether or not they need to be brightened up a little bit. But that technique can work really well in just trying to judge when you are working with a paint that's drying with a bit of a matte finish, whether or not you've got your contrast where it needs to be. Now, contrast is something that I talk about a lot in my YouTube videos and my slower tutorials on Patreon. Now, the contrast just makes such an overall difference to how much depth and realism we're getting in that piece. You might have the exact colour spot on to that reference photo, but if your shadows are not as dark as they need to be and your highlights are not as bright as they need to be, your painting will look flat, and that's obviously not what we're going for. I personally focus a lot more on the contrast than I do worrying about the exact colour. Now, of course, colour is important, but this painting here is a prime example with how you can focus on the colour later on. Really initially just focus on those details, map those in, get the texture that you're after, focusing on the fur direction and how long these brush strokes need to be, and once you've got those in place, you can then worry about the colour by applying your glazes on top. And this is something that I speak a lot about in my in-depth tutorials on Patreon, which if they're of interest, I'll link them in the description below. But I have a couple of videos on Patreon where I'm showing you how you can use an eyedropper tool to select the base layer colours and how you can design colour swatches as well to isolate the specific colours that you need, especially for your base layers, because I think that's one of the areas where the worrying about the exact colour holds us back even more than the colour on the final details. Because we're trying to apply that colour early on, it's something that we focus a lot about in the early stages when we really don't have to. So as I've mentioned, if those kinds of videos are also of interest, my Patreon is in the description below. So while I was waiting for the white section of the face to dry, I'm going to start mapping in the ear. Now this is a process that I will do regardless of what it is that I'm working on. You don't always want to use a hairdryer to dry that area, so you can just move on to the area next to it and work in between two sections. Now what you noticed with the ear though is I didn't just block in one solid colour, I have made sure I've painted in where my main sets of shadows are, and then I've just mixed a general brown to block in the areas around it. I personally like doing that because it's a lot easier to then follow that reference photo. I can clearly look back at my painting here and that reference photo and really easily see where I am at that point. Something that I did find I spent a lot of time with when I was new to painting is I'd really look at that photo, look back at my artwork, and I couldn't easily judge where I was. And one thing that I've learned the more that I've painted is I pick reference points. So that might be specific shadows, that might be more of maybe one more, a curl that you're working on might be more obvious than another. That for me is a reference point. I'll map that in, and then I know that I've got something that I can quickly look at and then back at that reference photo to see this is exactly where I am, and that's what I did on the ear by mapping in my main sets of shadows. The ears here on this dog are, because of how they're positioned on the head and how he's got them pinned back slightly, they aren't the typical shape. So that can make it a little bit challenging for us to process that, because when we are painting elements like ears, our brain says, I know what a dog ear looks like, and it starts to have a tendency to paint it how it thinks it should be, not what we're looking at in the reference photo. If you're finding that that is the case, pick those reference points and map in those main sets of shadows and highlights, because that will break down that one element into more manageable sections. Now another thing you can do if you are struggling with that is turn your artwork upside down and rotate the reference photo so it's also upside down, and that will help your brain to just focus on what it is you're painting for the abstract shapes. You won't then see the ear as a dog ear. It will just be, okay, there's a highlight at the bottom, there's a shadow here, and it's a lot easier to tackle. So the next full-length tutorial that I've got planned for Patreon is a white bulldog, and we're going to be focusing on all of the shorter white fur. This is one of the most common questions that I'm asked, so I wanted to make a dedicated video of that, and that's going to be available with the reference photo and the line art. I'm of course going to do a YouTube version as well, but the principle would be very similar in how I always start off with my darker grey base layer and then I build up my lighter layers from there. Now there are a lot of layers that go into painting white fur. It's one of those where you'd think it's probably one of the easiest colours to replicate, but for me I find it's actually one of the most challenging. Because there's so many tonal values that are very subtle, it doesn't just look one set colour as such. If you look at the face here, it looks brighter at the top of the stripe, but as we get down towards the nose, it does start to look a little darker, more of those greys. I had to make sure that I really do map that in at the beginning so that I've got that right level of depth within the various areas of this one lighter marking. For instance, I wouldn't just want to put solid white down because I wouldn't then have anywhere to go to build up my additional highlights. I had to work with a slightly darker base layer so that these details that I'm applying do show up. But it's really important, as you can see here, I'm actually using more layers here than in other areas of this painting. The white fur takes just as much time as any other colour, so try not to rush it. It's something that can very easily happen, but if we do that, this one section here would bring down the rest of the painting. And you'll notice as well that the slightly smaller, darker spots, the darker grey areas on the bridge of the nose, I mapped those in from the very beginning, and I did that deliberately. These markings are very unique to this dog, just like a Dalmatian with the spots. So you want to make sure that you've got these markings in the right place and that they are the right value. So what I mean by that is that they are the right level of darkness, or maybe it might be a brighter highlight. But you need to make sure that they are within the right range to replicate that marking of that animal. That will be the same with anything. So tiger stripes, that every tiger is going to be very different. Their stripes are like a fingerprint. So we want to make sure that we get that as accurate as we can to the reference photo. Now, the only thing that's different with working with wildlife subjects compared to someone's pet is that no one's going to know that's looking at your tiger painting, for instance, that one of the stripes might be in slightly different position, because unless you've got the reference photo, you really are not going to know. However, when you're doing pet portraits and you're painting someone's pet, they will know if those markings are not in the right place. So it's really important to make sure that you get those kinds of details accurate. You want to make sure that the eyes, the nose, the main features are 100% in the right place. Am I focusing that every single fur detail is painted in? No, not for me personally, because I like to go for photorealism rather than hyperrealism. But I do want to make sure they're as close as I can possibly get them. And that brings you on as well to your original line art. You want to make sure that whatever method of you have used, whether or not it's to freehand your sketch on your canvas or whether or not you've used a tracing and transfer option, you want to make sure that the initial outline is accurate. Otherwise, your proportions and the perspective are going to be wrong from the very beginning. And something to always bear in mind when you are painting white fur is to remember that when it's varnished, it's going to look like that paint is wet again. The only reason why I say this again is because there are many times where I'll be painting white fur and I'll keep trying to add more of my brighter layers, but I'm not getting them any brighter than I want. There will be a couple of reasons for that. One is because obviously by the time it's varnished, that colour's going to be a lot better. The contrast is going to be sharper. And the other reason is if that is happening, it's usually because the area next to it isn't dark enough. As soon as you darken up that one element next to your lighter markings, that will automatically then make the white fur look brighter. So if you have done your details and you're using, let's say, pure titanium white, and you're still not happy with how bright that is, but you cannot get it any lighter, make the element that's next to it slightly darker. And you'll find that will then really help with the desired outcome that you're after. So it's also at this stage here where it's very tempting to add your whiskers in now. The biggest tip that I would give anybody is to leave the whiskers until the very last layer. If you add them in now, we're then going to have to paint around them when we start to add the neck and the chest. And that's going to make our life so much more difficult, and it will take far longer than it needs to be. So here, while I'm gradually building up the depth here, where the whiskers would be, I need to remember to ignore those details and leave them till the very end. So once I work on the chest portion, what I actually did here for this is use my airbrush. So I mapped in where my basic lights and darks were, but as I got lower down in towards more of the body, I switched over to my airbrush. If you don't have an airbrush, what I would be doing is using the wet on wet blending technique using a fine mist sprayer bottle. And I speak about this a lot in that blending video, which is on YouTube, which, as I say, I will link in the description below. But what I would do to start with is apply a light layer of water first and then add the layer of paint in if you want a really soft edge. You can then make sure that the brush strokes you're applying are going to be easily more blended because the surface is already slightly wet. Now, I don't want it too wet. There is a fine balance. If you do accidentally put a little bit too much water on that surface, wait for it to dry. But if you've already got more of that moisture there on the canvas to start with, your brush strokes are going to be a lot softer. You can then use a makeup or more of the mop brush, which is those larger, softer brushes, in small round circular movements to really soften out the edge of the chest and create something very similar to what I am here with the airbrush. But if you don't have access to an airbrush, as I say, a fine mist sprayer bottle will give you something very similar, and it's a tool that I use an awful lot in my acrylic paintings. I also used it on the main section of the black and white horse that I uploaded a few weeks ago, which I show it on the main. I wanted all of that to be a really nice soft blended base layer, so I did just apply the water to start with once I put my initial base layer down, and because I then was adding my darker colour on top, I didn't want that contrast to be really sharp. Because I wanted the main to look nice and soft, I therefore didn't need any harsh edges on that base layer. So by putting in a layer of the water first and then adding the paint, I was able to really soften out my brush strokes, avoiding any harsh lines. So given the angle of the photo here of this dog slightly more upright, I decided to add the detail to the chest, but not quite as much detail as what there was on the face, just so that I could keep the main focus there. Because the eyes and the reflections there were so bright, I wanted to keep that focus on the face itself. So you'll see here that I'm indicating at the fur direction, but it's not going to be to the same degree in terms of how bright I'm going to go with my contrasts, because I do want all of that to remain on the face itself. I had also designed this painting on my computer to start with, so I knew where I had to fade out the chest because it needed to be balanced because of the dog to the right. I wanted to make sure that it was a good composition, there was equal spacing from the edge of the canvas and, for instance, where the ears started. Now, it was one of the common questions that I got on my Patreon channel is how do I design my layouts for my pet portraits and my wildlife work? So what I decided to do is make a dedicated video, actually recording my computer screen, so I can show you how I create the layouts and the software that I use. So if that kind of element as well is of interest, that is on my Patreon channel. So this part here, when I'm working on the neck and the faded chest portion, I always make sure I get this 100% complete before I add my final details. So once I've done the chest, I will then always take a step back from my easel and see whether or not I need to make any changes before I add my whiskers. I know I've already mentioned that, but it's really important. There have been quite a few times where I've been painting something, I think I finished, I've added the whiskers, and then I've realised I needed to brighten something, and then you do have to paint around them. You can also then end up with a bit of a halo effect around the whisker. So let's say I needed to lighten the part of the chest. If I didn't want to bring all of these brush details up to the whiskers, I end up then with a darker border around it, like that halo effect. That really doesn't look nice, so the easiest thing to do is just to leave those to the very last layers. Something that you can do is put that painting aside for a couple of days when you do think it's finished, look at it again with fresh eyes, and if you do then know that you are 100% done, then add the whiskers in. And that's something I recommend to do with every painting. You know, we spend days, sometimes weeks, on one painting at a time. It can be really easy to get a little bit blinded by the details because we've been staring at it for so long. So when I do think my portrait's finished, I'll put it away in a drawer for a day or two, and that's when I'll get it out, see if there's anything that I need to change. If there's anything that's bugging me that I think I don't quite like that, I need to change it, I will do it at that point, and then I will call it finished. One of the most common things that can happen is we have a tendency to call our artwork finished too soon, when sometimes spending an additional half an hour makes such a difference. So one just quick tip here before this video ends is painting whiskers. You want to make sure there that you've got the various lengths, really study that reference photo. This dog here had a mixture of black whiskers and white whiskers, so you really want to make sure that you've got them accurate. Again, just like the markings, they're very unique to that one animal. So I really hope this video was of use. If it was, I'd really appreciate it if you could give it a thumbs up because it really does help. And if you want to get notified of future content, hit the subscribe and the bell button. And as I've mentioned, if my slower in-depth tutorials are of use, I will link my Patreon in the description below. I'll be uploading another video to YouTube at the weekend. And as always, thank you so much for watching.